Just as a side note, neither myself nor Bob or Jack will be here next Sunday. I don't know if you guys know, Bob just celebrated his 50th birthday. And I guess when you turn 50, it's just like an ongoing celebration. So he had his birthday. The guys, the men, some of us had like a game night also after. And I don't know if you know this about Bob. He really loves tea. He loves tea. I've never seen a person that loves tea as much as Bob. So part of the ongoing celebration, he wanted to go have some tea. Like, you know, those fancy tea place houses. I don't like tea that much. So we were looking for places that serve tea. And apparently, San Diego does not have very good tea houses, places. I don't even know what they're called. Is there a thing? Probably not. So we had to just, broaden our search, and eventually that led us to London. Because apparently they have really good tea in London. And unfortunately, they're only open on Sundays. So we will not be here next Sunday.
Yeah, we dumped all ours in the harbor.
Yes. Circling back in history. But the following week we'll be back, and Dorian will bring the message next week. Here we are, Daniel chapter 4. Yes, that's right. We're in Daniel. And we've been going through the book of Daniel. I already mentioned this. Half of the book, the first 6 chapters, they are these extraordinary stories that Daniel documents. So we've already gone through 3 chapters. Some of these we kind of cut them in half, so more than 3 weeks, but we've gone through 3 stories, and here we have this 4th extraordinary story. This chapter we will also just look at the first portion of the story, so from verse 1 to verse 18 of chapter 4. And what you will see, different than what we've already seen in the previous 3 chapters, Daniel is not so much narrating the story, it's actually Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar is speaking, and you'll see that he's using the first person, and Daniel very likely just borrowed a document that Nebuchadnezzar himself made available to others to include it in his account of this portion of the Hebrew Jewish history that they were captives in Babylon. So here we have essentially a portion of Daniel, but it's Nebuchadnezzar speaking. And very likely this was a part of an edict of sorts. It was a letter sent out to his subjects, something that Nebuchadnezzar did. We don't know exactly when, very likely many years after the events of chapter 3. And what you will also see, just based on how history is unfolding, so if we backtrack a little bit, we know that chapter 3 was Nebuchadnezzar's response to chapter 2. What was in chapter 2? Chapter 2 had to do with Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the first dream that he had, which kept him up for a while. And he rounded up the wise men and told them, hey, not only describe the dream, I'm not even going to tell you, you have to tell me what the dream was, but I want you to also make sense of it. Right? You have to tell me the meaning as well. The wise men the group of people that were his counselors, the magicians, the astrologers, they couldn't do it. And Daniel was the one that was able to decipher the dream, not only tell him the dream, but decipher it. And if you remember, if you recall, if you were here, or if you've read this portion of Daniel, the dream had to do with this figure, this statue of sorts. And the head was made out of gold, and then the other portions of this figure was made out of other elements and other metals. And finally, you got to the base, the feet. And the meaning of that dream had to do with Nebuchadnezzar being the golden head. In other words, the one portion of this figure that was most honorable. And every other section, they were kingdoms that would follow Nebuchadnezzar's reign and rule over essentially the known world at that point in time. Basically, it meant that in one way, in a good way, Nebuchadnezzar was thought of as the most honorable. However, it also meant that his time was expiring. Eventually, other kings and other kingdoms would take over, and if you move forward in history enough, eventually the king would deal with that type of earthly reign. And the dream also had to do with this boulder-like thing that would crush the statue and again become the primary focal point of all of humanity, which we alluded to or pointed to as possibly a reference to Christ. So Daniel gave the interpretation of the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. And a few years later, seemingly, even though Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged God, praised God for the fact that he was able to have that information through Daniel, fast forward to chapter 3, very likely a few years, now Nebuchadnezzar is back to his old ways. So he seems rather annoyed, bothered by the fact that God, through Daniel, was telling him that his time was going to expire, that he would not reign for as long as he wanted. And because of that, very likely, he built or had built on his behalf and on behalf of his God an image, but this image was all made out of gold, at least gold-plated. And the catch was, every single time his subjects heard instruments, the sound of instruments, they were supposed to stop everything and bow down to this image that was erected, constructed on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar's God, but truly it was acknowledging his power, his prowess, his might, his influence. The problem was, there were certain people within that environment that would not honor, would not worship that image, namely Daniel's 3 friends. Other people kind of threw them under the bus, and because of that, Nebuchadnezzar was furious. So he threw them in this fiery furnace. Miraculously, in a supernatural way, and there was no doubt about it, they survived. They were just walking around there. Nebuchadnezzar actually saw a 4th person, which he described as the Son of God. When the 3 friends came out, once again, Nebuchadnezzar had no choice but to acknowledge the fact that their God was Lord of all. And now we have chapter 4. Again, the story is continuing, and it's not one thing after another. 1 week passes, 1 month. Very likely many years now have passed. And now God is the one responding. As I stated, chapter 3 was Nebuchadnezzar's response to what God had to say on chapter 2. And now in chapter 4, it's God's response to Nebuchadnezzar's actions in chapter 3. In other words, God was going to put Nebuchadnezzar in his place. We're not going to read, as I've said, the story in its entirety, but it has to do with another dream. Another dream that Nebuchadnezzar had that God was providing. And in a similar fashion, he couldn't make sense of it, so he needed help. Let's go ahead and read through the entire portion that we have here. So once again, I'll read and you can follow along, starting from verse 1 all the way to verse 18. And it states here, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts on my bed and the vision of my head troubled me. Therefore, I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream before him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secret troubles you. Explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation. These were the visions of my head while on my bed. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of all the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, chop down the tree, cut off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruits. Let the beasts get out from under it, and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze. In the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of the heaven, and let him graze with the beasts. One on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, declare its interpretations, since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy God is in you. So again, here we have the first portion of this story that has to do with another dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Now, it's important for us just to reflect upon the person of Nebuchadnezzar. Again, he was the king of Babylon, which was one of the, if not the primary empires at this particular time of the world. Essentially, one of the, if not the most powerful men on earth at this point in history. The Bible actually talks a lot about Nebuchadnezzar. Not only in the book of Daniel, but we have references of him in 2 Kings, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. Speaks of his name over 90 times. Truly someone that the Bible focuses on. And again, truth be told, just a pagan king. But based on the stories that we have from Scripture, not only in Daniel, but in these other places, it seems like God had a very special interest in Nebuchadnezzar. This is actually the last that we will hear of him based on the chronology of events that is found in the book of Daniel. Once we get to chapter 5, there's another king in charge of Babylon, and then eventually the whole empire is going to fall. I believe it's his grandson, if I'm not mistaken. So here we have essentially the end of his story. But again, it is a story that points to the fact that God was very much interested in this particular person. And we see somewhat of a process that he is going through. There is progress, even though you kind of have to read between the line and focus on certain elements of his story. But for example, here, as I've stated, we have Nebuchadnezzar's own words. And if you compare what he has provided just in this portion of the chapter, it seems like he is very much in a good place pertaining to his acknowledgement of who God is. But this was very much a process. So if we go back to chapter 2, for example, when we have the story of his initial dream, once it was interpreted by Daniel, again, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged something. What did he acknowledge? If you look at chapter 2, verse 47, it states there, "The king answered Daniel and said, 'Truly, your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret.'" It's a good start. Based on the fact that Daniel was able to interpret, through God's power, the dream that was tormenting him, keeping him up at night, many nights, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged, "Your God seems pretty special." If we go to chapter 3, something similar happens. So after Nebuchadnezzar threw Daniel's friends in the fiery furnace, but then he saw a fourth person there who looked like the Son of God, and they left, came out of the furnace after he called them out, and they were unscathed. Nothing burnt. They didn't even smell like smoke. And then, what does he acknowledge? Look what it says on chapter 3, verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God." Again, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. a further acknowledgement. Now even a blessing of sorts. He's honoring their God. And now look at how he continues to progress in this acknowledgement of who God is. On chapter 4, instead of talking about Daniel's God, instead of talking about Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego's God, what does he say? I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. Do you see the progress? Now he is just basically saying, the God. Not their God only, the God. Here, he was still dealing with the idea that this is one of many, but definitely the most powerful, and not only theirs, he is the. Again, we're seeing progress. We're seeing a person who is on his way. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the second portion of the story. But there's debate whether or not Nebuchadnezzar was ever saved, legitimately saved. We do have certain portions of his story, such as this one, that leads us to believe that that is, at the very least, a strong possibility. We don't know for sure. But again, it seems like he was well on his way to not only acknowledging who God was, but submitting to his rule. Look what it says on verse 3 once again. How great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Once again, read this in light of chapter 2. Chapter 2 had to do with God explaining to Nebuchadnezzar, you are a great king, for sure, but your time will end. Your reign will cease to exist. To Nebuchadnezzar, that was a very hard thing to do. And even though none of us are kings here, or queens for that matter, royalty, dignitaries, the idea of time ceasing, expiring, is a rather uncomfortable one. It touches upon an aspect of humanity that we take for granted when we're young. Remember when you were young? Or those of you who are still young, not paying attention to me, you don't remember because you haven't, could care less what I'm saying right now. But part of the perk of being young is not caring about the end, because it's never going to come. It seems so far away that you don't even acknowledge the possibility that this will all be over one day. But as the time goes on, unfolds, as life happens, you get closer and closer and closer to the end. And the anxiety starts to build up. It doesn't have to be something, horrible or especially fearful. But it's natural. It's part of the human condition. And it humbles us. Because again, at a point in time, we felt invincible. Almost eternal. And now we are confronted by the fact that we are not. Yet there is one who is. And he is in charge. He has dominion over all, including our days. It may happen today, it may happen tomorrow, or the day after, and we are submissive to that. He is in control. That reality becomes much more clearer as time goes on. And it is humbling. It is humbling, and it's meant to be humbling. knowing that he has control over all, including that, your and my mortality. Nebuchadnezzar was dealing with this fact. And now seemingly he has come to terms with, my reign will end. His reign will continue. My dominion is limited. His dominion is endless. This is the one and true King of Kings. Seemingly, Nebuchadnezzar was in a good portion of time in his particular story. He states here on verse 5, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. So again, very likely many years after the events that we covered in chapter 3, he had conquered not only Judah, but Syria, not Egypt per se, but definitely they were on their heels. Again, an empire that had a lot of influence and power, prestige, including him being its emperor. He was in a good place. Now he was just resting. He was taking advantage of the fruits of all of his conquest, seemingly having a good time. And while he was having a good time, again, in response to the previous chapter or the events contained in it, God knocks on the door. And as he was enjoying life, this occurred. And another dream was provided to him. And much like the previous story that included a dream, Nebuchadnezzar seemingly couldn't figure it out on his own. So he did something similar to what he did previously. He rounded up all of the wise men, but here we notice something drastically different. If you remember the details of the story of the first dream, when he interacted with the wise men, he basically said, look, you need to interpret it, but also need to tell me. And then their response was, come on, king, that is absurd. No one has ever asked anyone, how do you expect us not only to interpret, but also to tell you the dream if you're not going to inform us of that? Remember, he got kind of ticked off, furious, and started killing off wise men left and right. And part of their argument then was, if you only tell us the dream, then we can interpret it. I don't know, seemed like Nebuchadnezzar was a wiser, more mature king by this time in his life. So here he just told them. He said, I won't spit on your beautiful shoes here. He told them, this isn't the dream. Ironically, before they were very sure of themselves, saying, if you tell us the dream, we'll interpret it. Here, he did, and they still couldn't. And if you think about it, again, the dream, the description of it is here. And most of you know the story, you know the second part of, this account. But even if you don't, this dream, truth be told, it doesn't seem very hard to decipher. Maybe you didn't catch on just based on my first reading of the dream. But if you go through it again and take your time to think about the elements, the symbolism of this dream, it is not very hard to decipher it. You don't need to be extra wise. You don't need to be endowed with information from above to kind of know more or less what is happening. Yet, the wise men, maybe they were wise enough not to want to tell them. Maybe that's why they were wise. Because again, seemingly it had to do with him, something that he was, yet something that would occur and happen. Even if they couldn't figure out exactly every single detail, it did not seem like something good. So they were wise enough to say, hey, sorry, we can't, I am clueless. You know how when you're kids, you're interacting with your kids, and they act like they have no idea what you're talking about, right? But I had no idea. Tree? What? Branches, leaves, and what? I had no idea. You ask someone else. I no clue. So the story goes on, and then all of a sudden, we are reintroduced to Daniel. Seemingly, he came later after the wise men failed horribly, either unintentionally or intentionally. And then, as before, Daniel is charged with this particular interpretation. It is interesting that, again, the story follows a similar pattern. And the pattern is Nebuchadnezzar is trying to rely upon the resources that he has available from a human perspective. Eventually, when that fails, falters, he goes on and relies upon what is left. The last resort. No one else could do it. Here is Daniel. He is the main dude amongst the wise men. But it's interesting that he wasn't relied upon initially, but now, since everyone has failed, now here he is to save the day. It is significant because it does parallel the trends of our very human condition. How often does God become the last resort? Sometimes it's because we don't want to bother God. Again, all of these wise men doing God knows what, might as well use them. Don't really need to rely upon God. Let them have a crack at it. Oftentimes it's just because of our pride, our lack of dedication to Him and wanting to take charge of our own lives. And again, utilizing the resources that we feel we are in control of. But whatever that may be, often the struggles of the human condition have to do with, yes, we acknowledge that there's a God, but He becomes the last resort. When everything fails, when all things falter, now we rely upon Him. And if you think about this, God is very much aware. He was aware here, and He is aware now. And the fact that He would humble Himself, knowingly humble Himself, to continuously become the last resort of humanity, that's amazing. Put yourself in His shoes. The Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, dominion over all, sovereign, all-powerful, all-knowing God, yet willing, humbly willing to allow us to try to figure it out on our own. And while this is happening, He's here. And then when everything that we try to do falls apart, He looks at us and we look at Him and He says, "Are you done? Are you sure you've tried it all? No other tricks, theories, ways, efforts. Are you finally done? Here I am, your last resort. I've always been here since the beginning, yet here I am. Through Daniel, God was Nebuchadnezzar's last resort. A good one, because again, no one else seemingly could figure out this dream. From verse 10 to verse 18, we have the description of the dream. I'm not going to go into great detail because, again, the second portion of the story has everything to do with not only the description of the dream, but what actually occurred, because this was somewhat of a warning of what would happen to Nebuchadnezzar, something very humbling, humiliating even. But again, God's response to Nebuchadnezzar's response. And if we look at this story, at least this portion of the story, as I've stated, Nebuchadnezzar is a very interesting figure, not only in biblical history, but in world history. Real dude. And God was very much interested, to the point where he would not allow even Nebuchadnezzar to go about his life in his own way. God seemed invested in Nebuchadnezzar. And even though Nebuchadnezzar tried his hardest, God would not give up. Possibly, this is an example of grace. Irresistible grace, even. We have this idea about God where he bestows grace upon humanity, sort of like sprinkling magical dust. And some people choose whether to take advantage of said magical dust or not. But what the Bible really truly shows us is that once God tosses his magical, grace-filled dust upon our tiny little foolish heads, we have no choice. It is irresistible. It has landed upon us. We can try to fight it. We can try to ignore it. We can try to, again, figure things out on our own. But he's already bestowed grace upon us based on his sovereign decision. It seems like this is what is happening with Nebuchadnezzar. God simply will not, I repeat, he will not give up on this man. Grace. When we think about grace, often we think about butterflies, rainbows, hummingbirds, right? Because it seems so pleasant. Do you know that very often grace comes in the form of pain? It's God doing something that he knows it's good for us eternally, even at the cost of our temporal, present, temporary discomfort. Going out of his way to make sure that, again, we not only acknowledge him as Lord, but also Savior. And oftentimes, there is pain involved. There is discomfort, as we will see with Nebuchadnezzar. Yet, seemingly, and again, regardless of what Nebuchadnezzar tried to do, God would not give up on him. And God does not give up on us, those who he chooses to be his children, those who benefit directly from Christ's sacrifice, death, resurrection, and redemption through him. Amen.